Hey everyone, welcome to Thinking Christian, and in this new series that I'm going to be starting, I'm going to be talking about what is called Simulation Theology. So in this video, we're going to get started. We're going to talk about what simulation theology actually is and whether thinking about these things or asking these sorts of questions will be interesting or useful to you. So let's go ahead and get started. Don't worry, I'm still going to be doing a lot of my other videos as well. I just wanted to start this because frankly, I don't see anyone else doing it. So we're going to have fun, and this is my field of research, not simulation theology, but some of the fields related to it. So I do have a unique perspective I can bring to this, even though I don't really know much theology, but I still think I can do sim theology as well. So let's define what simulation theology is. So let's first start by looking at theology in the first place. So theology is defined as the study of the nature of God and religious belief. And it's a compound word consisting of theo, meaning God, and ology, which is the study of. So you put the two together and you get theology, which is the study of God, similar to how psychology is the study of the mind. And what David Chalmers says, he's a philosopher of mind, he says, look, theology is roughly the study of the nature of God from the point of view of God's subject. So it's us as humans basically reasoning about the nature or existence of God, if you believe in the existence of God. So if we take this idea, we can take simulation theology to be applying these sorts of insights that we get from simulated worlds to the idea of theology and two traditional sorts of religious doctrines. So David Chalmers defines simulation theology as the study of nature, or study of the nature of the simulator as God from the point of view of those within the simulation. And my definition is slightly different, but really my definition would be, look, simulation theology is just the study of God, or theology, but using insights from philosophy, computer science, electrical and computer engineering, and simulation theory. So once again, applying these tools that we have, these modern ideas from virtual worlds and simulated worlds, and using these as analogies to help us understand the nature and existence of God. One way you could say is, look, we're looking at the virtual simulated worlds that we have, we're looking at the simulation hypothesis, and just asking, what do these things tell us about God, about God's existence, about the possibility of God existing, these other sorts of things, and look at how this is kind of similar to natural theology, which is theology applied to looking at the natural world. So natural theology is, what does the natural world tell us about God, or what can we understand about God from just looking at the natural world or the natural sciences? Similarly, simulation theology is doing the same thing, but from simulation theory, virtual worlds, these types of problems. Now let's look at some of the types of questions that sim theory is going to ask, and these are going to be useful going forward when we talk about some things like simulation estachology, or like what does the end of the simulation look like? These other sorts of things if we do live in a simulation. So these are the sorts of questions, right? If we live in a simulation, what is the nature or purpose of the simulation we're in? How would we know whether or not we're in a simulation? That's another question. If we are in a simulation, what is the nature of the entity that began the simulation? What can our experiences with us creating our own virtual worlds tell us about God or God's possible purpose? So if we've all played games or created our own types of simulations, how does our experience from that angle, from basically playing God, allow us to reason a little bit more about maybe God's reasoning? That's kind of an interesting way to think about it. One question would be, is God simply a programmer in the next world up? Meaning, could God himself be a simulated entity, what we consider to be God, himself be a simulated being in another world? That's another question that sim theory is going to ask. What does simulation theory tell us about traditional religious doctrines or dogmas? So what are the insights that we can get from simulation theory when it comes to things like, let's say, the resurrection of Jesus, or other religious ideas that we have, things like punishment, heaven and hell, sin, these other sorts of things that we can really put an interesting spin on these topics by looking at them in the context of simulation theory and simulation theology. One really interesting thing you can say is traditional religious doctrines are now compatible under naturalism, and I'll talk about that in another video, but that's kind of an interesting thing to think about as well. Now, there are a few caveats I want to talk about when talking about sim theology, because it doesn't necessarily mean an acceptance of simulation theory itself. So in other words, you don't necessarily need to believe in the simulation hypothesis to do work in sim theology or to understand it. In that case, you can basically just say, hey, look, us creating our own simulations tells us something about maybe puts us in a way of playing God and allows us to understand God better, even if we're not living in a simulation. So you don't have to believe that. You don't have to buy into the simulation hypothesis. To be honest, I'm pretty agnostic about it. I'm like, we could live in a simulation. We could not. We could live in a sort of pseudo simulation because, most of these things are analogies. So it's like all of our simulations that we can think of are silicon based. But whether or not we are in a simulation, it may not be silicon based. Maybe it's based on something else, some other completely different type of thing. So it's difficult to reason about this. And I don't want to get too far in asking the question whether or not we live in an actual reality, a simulated reality, whether those words are even meaningful distinction for us. Rather, it's just asking these really important types of questions and allowing us to do some interesting philosophy. So I would say, yeah, still, whatever the case is, the idea of simulated worlds and the possibility of whether we live in one has enormous impacts on our idea of God. And like I said, once again, consider these to be analogies rather than arguments for us living in an actual simulation. That in this case, I think the details of whether or not we live in a simulated reality is less important to what our experience building our own simulations and whether or not, for instance, simulated minds can have a conscious experience will tell us about whether or not we live in a simulation, whether or not God is a sort of simulator in a certain aspect. So that's the caveat I want to have. It's not arguing about the simulation theory. That would be part of it. But once again, regardless of whether or not the simulation hypothesis is true, there's still a lot of interesting work to be done in simulation theology. So one of the thought experiments I want to kind of leave off with is think of The Sims. If you ever played a video game like The Sims, which is a virtual world where you have people that kind of do things and you can kind of tell them what to do. And in what case are you, when you play a game like this, basically playing God? Now, you didn't really build the simulation yourself. So, in some ways you're not really, unless you're the programmer of The Sims, I forget who did it. I don't think it was Sid Meier. But anyway, unless you're the person who programmed Sims, you're not the traditional idea of God, but you do get to sort of play God to a certain case. In the case that you do get to see what's going on, you get pretty much near unlimited control over the world. I mean, there are boundaries put in place. But in what case would it be the case if the Sims, the people who are in the Sims, began to wonder if they lived in a simulation? What would they think about you as the simulator? Would they think you're a jerk? Would they think you're a kind, benevolent creature? Would they think you're sort of deserving of worship? These are the sorts of questions, the sorts of thought experiments that we're going to be asking here when it comes to simulation theology. I have a lot of other videos and a lot of other interesting topics planned. So let me know what you think. Let me know what you think. And if there's any other sorts of questions you want me to explore, like I said, I really want to do some videos on Simulation Estachology and some other types of things. But once again, remember here, we're looking at these things as analogies and as telling us information, and rather than necessarily making the argument that we live in a simulation or not. I think that's a kind of a related question, but I don't want us to get too bogged down in that detail. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.